I could fill in the branch after I have the share screen up there.
No. Well, this is better.
To give you all an idea of the size, the relative size of what we're talking about here, these are the leaves of the acacia growing right outside of our front door. And this, you can see these small thorns. Those are the smallest ones. The thorns get much larger than that on other trees. But this particular tree has got small thorns. But this is the relative size of what we're talking about. I hope you can see that. I can't really figure out whether you can see it or not. Yeah, there, I guess you can. Yeah. Okay. All right. Also, I should add that the reason why I can hold it in my hand is that the ants, that particular branch doesn't have many ants on it. But if it did, I also would be holding it because over time, I've handled so much of this that I've been stung so often by the ants that I'm not bothered by the sting. Other animals are very reactive to it. It's like a bee sting. But if you're a beekeeper or you have work with these ants, eventually you get used to that as long as you don't get allergic to it. Okay. Now, let's go back here to where we are. This is where we ended up yesterday. And there's Caio with his meter stick in his hand to give you an idea how big this tree has grown in about 2 years, something like that, with a very healthy ant colony protecting it. 20 years later, it looks like this. You can see Caio down there at the bottom.
Dan, you haven't shared your screen yet.
You have not shared your screen yet.
Oh, I thought I did. I'm sorry. Okay. Sorry. Okay.
It's 2-step, and then you click save.
Okay, and then I have to hit this one over here too.
Right.
Yes. Okay. There we go. Okay, we'll go back one. All right. So here. There's Caio over here holding a meter stick in his hand to give you an idea how big the tree can grow in about 2 years if it has a healthy ant colony. Remember, that's going from something that looks like this, and before that, it looked like that, all right? But that's the bonsai tree for several years until it finally gets an ant colony. When it gets an ant colony for protection by the queen having made her colony there in the little new thorn, then it is a growth spurt right away, makes a lot of thorns, a lot of leaves, and makes a nice, healthy ant colony with lots of workers patrolling the surface. And it looks like this then, a year and a half, maybe 2 years later, something like that. It should show how well it does if it has a protective ant colony. 20 years later, as it's dying of old age, we've cut it out of the forest and held it up against the sky so that you can see the whole tree as it's dying. This is the old age, and the colony is dying. You see that there's almost no food being produced up here, almost no leaves. There may be a queen still, or there may not be a queen still. But as soon as she's dead, the colony's dead. So here's Caio for scale down here, holding that tree up against the sky so you can see it. So we go from something like that to something like that. And all that time, it was growing new branches, and they were shedded as the new ones were built. And as they were shedded, the queen had to keep moving up and up and up and up and up and up. So she might have had that 10 times or 15 times in the course of 10 or 15 years. She may have had to change that queen thorn. Okay. Now, so when I say the ants protect the tree, this is what I'm talking about. This is 24 hours a day patrolling on the surface of the tree. Now, if we were to disturb the tree by kicking it or starting to chew into it or doing anything like that, the ants run frantically in all directions trying to locate who's doing the damage. And at that point, they're running so fast it's very hard to even get a photograph of them. But they're basically finding the disturbance by running frantically around and at the same time releasing an alarm pheromone, which is not the same as a sexual pheromone, which the virgin females use to attract males. So these ladies are all generating an alarm pheromone, which you can smell. If you were standing here a meter away from this, you could actually smell this disturbed colony. And at night, of course, a cow or a horse who actually walks up to one of these things in a pasture would smell it as well and would know not to stick its head into that acacia to feed on the leaves. Okay? So that's the patrolling surface. This is what happens if a caterpillar lands, for whatever reason, on that leaf. It could walk up to it, it could fall on it, it could be born there from an egg. Now, these ants have found it. And the striking thing about them is that their ancestors were predators. So the ancestor would have a response, the evolutionary ancestor would be, the response to this little caterpillar would be to grab it, sting it, kill it or paralyze it, and march off back to the hollow twig somewhere to chop it up into pieces as prey for the larvae. Very normal predator response. These ants have evolved the response of being police and not predators. So they attack the caterpillar. They bite it. They may even sting it some, but mostly not. And pick it up and walk over to the edge of the leaf and drop it. So it's like a policeman grabbing a drunk on the street and walking him off the street and parking him somewhere, all right? And where the ants want to park this caterpillar is not on the tree. So their whole goal in life is to get rid of it. If it's an insect, which can really grab a hold of the tree and say, I am not leaving, this is what happens. You can see the bug underneath this pileup of ants. And what they're doing is piling up on the bug more and more and more and more, biting and biting and biting and stinging and stinging. And finally the bug says, I've had it, I'm out of here. Okay, so that's the patrolling process that's going on 24 hours a day. Now, I didn't know anything about the scientific literature or scientific knowledge about this system. I didn't even know that this guy, Thomas Belt, had written a book, taking it back to Europe, and described it as a sort of not entomologist, a mining engineer. He described it in a book to Europe, and he said, the ants are protecting the tree. Very logical for somebody to see. Well, at the same time, this guy, William Morton Wheeler, about 1900, was the god of ant biology in the world. He was a full professor at Harvard University, and he was viewed as the authority on all ants. And he published an article as a response to the discussion that was going on in Europe about whether these ants do or do not protect the plant, stating that plants need the ants like a dog needs its fleas. And I always found that to be a very, when I finally read this, I found this to be a very strange observation by an ant authority who'd obviously looked at a lot of ants doing a lot of things. And I could never figure out why he said that in print. Of course, he's expired now, but that exists still, and it's still in print, and I encountered it as a graduate student. And then one of the most famous ant biologists on the earth today, Ed Wilson at Harvard, explained to me that Wheeler did not believe in evolution. He was a very firmly religious person and felt that evolution was anti his religion, which was straight Protestant religion. And for him to say that the ants have an influence on the tree and that could be the tree react to the ants required if you should say, going along with the concept of evolution. And he simply flatly stated, no, they can't be protecting the tree. As they say, the tree needs them like a dog needs its fleas. So that's where the world was stuck in the 1960 when I bumped into this reaction completely by accident. I knew nothing about any of this, nor the many languages in Europe about which it had been argued. I was simply looking for a thesis project in Veracruz, Mexico. Why in Veracruz, Mexico? Because I had gone to the tropics when I was 14 years old in ninth grade and spent a lot of time collecting butterflies. So I wanted to go back there to do my thesis research. And I was walking down a trail and a beetle flew over my head, landed on a piece of vegetation in front of me. And at that moment, an ant ran up to it, grabbed it, and the beetle jumped off. And I didn't think anything about it, except that later on I walked down the same trail and I looked at the tree and I thought, why was there an ant there to grab the beetle? And at that point, I looked closely at the tree and saw all those ants running around on the surface of the tree, all this kind of stuff. So what I did was cut down 2 of these trees to drag them back to the house and dissect them to see what was inside those thorns. What I'm telling you is that all this was discovered not by hypothesis, not by thinking about it logically, but by pure accident. So I cut down 2 of these trees, about the size of the one you saw next to Caio, and I decided to leave one there and drag the other one back to the house. I got back to the house, dissected it, discovered the ants inside, all that kind of stuff. Then it was just a curiosity. 45 days later, I walked back through the same pasture, and there were the 2 stumps. And one of the stumps had a gorgeous, beautiful new stump sprout growing out of it. And the other one was nearly dead. And they were only about 1 meter apart. This is what the one that was nearly dead looked like. As you can see, it's made little sprouts. Here's another one, another one, another one. The leaves are all eaten off. It's in really terrible shape. This is dead up here. Now let's look at what the other one looked like. You see this beautiful new stump sprout going right up here like that. Big, healthy leaves. That's my clipboard behind them. Big thorns on the branches. Beautiful condition. Just 1 meter away from the other one. The whole difference was this had the ant colony. This one did not have an ant colony. Now, I've just told it to you as it happened to me. But shortly later, I walked through an area that had been burned. And that's where these photographs are actually from. In this area, the fire went through and was hot enough to kill this stem here, but not the roots underground. So they could produce new shoots. But it was hot enough to kill the ant colony. The one 1 meter away, same thing happened. Fire was hot enough to kill the above ground part, but did not kill the ant colony. So the ant colony just moved over to the stump sprouts, and now this little stump sprout has got this healthy big ant colony that used to be in this big tree here. So my PhD thesis was basically repeating that natural experiment 5,000 times in many different places: deep shade, full sun, edges of beaches, in exposed areas, and bad soils, good soils, old agricultural fields, not agricultural fields, many different ways, showing that you always got the same result. If you lost the ant colony, the tree died. So now how do we actually show this? Because in those days, you think of experimental biology as a normal way of going at science. At that time, this was such a novel idea that departments were being called a department of experimental biology, as though that was a new kind of biology. So you had observational biology, which this would have fallen under, and experimental biology, which is what practically all biology departments do today. Okay? That's all you think about is experiments. Nobody starts with a raw observation. Well, you do when you got COVID killing a lot of people, and that's the raw observation. But you go into it by experiments. Well, in this particular case, I needed to do experiments to show that this wasn't just the other possibility, because the fire could have gone through here, killed some ant colonies, not others. The ant colonies that were not killed could simply walk out across the ground and colonize a nice growing shoot. So then that doesn't mean then that the one that looks like this, it looks like that because it didn't have an ant colony. Okay? And the one that looks like that because it has an ant colony. Say that one attracted the ant colony. So I had to do real experiments. So what's the real experiment? Well, here we are looking at an old cornfield in Veracruz, Mexico. And the vegetation there is about 2 meters tall. And then these things sticking out of the top are acacias. So I go to the father of Caio, who owns this cornfield, and I say, can we cut it all down? And I explain why. And he says, well, sure, okay, because he's going to plant this to corn later on anyway, right? So he's happy to clear this, what we call secondary vegetation, away. So this is what it looks like after you go through and you cut down a big patch of all the vegetation. But you see the stumps, the individual stumps with the white tops slashed off. Each one of those is 65 centimeters above the ground. In other words, there's a visible stump. And inside this white string square that you see here, there are 25 of those. And each of those acacias, when it was cut off, was carried out and piled in a pile, which we then burned up. So now you're looking at 25 acacias inside this plot with no ant colonies. We do the same thing where I'm standing taking the photograph for another plot with 25 in it. And there, when we cut down the top of the tree, we just drop it right at the base of the acacia stump. So the colony is still there, whereas this has no colony. Well, I think it doesn't take a genius to guess what is going to happen. This is 45 days later in the plots that have the ant colonies still there. There's the 65 centimeter tall stump. And here are the individual sprouts with their thorns. And this is a heavily occupied young tree where the colony was in the cut down top, which was lying right here on the ground. And they just moved right into it and protected it. The same 45 days later in the same plot next door, they look like this. You can see it made branches and it made thorns, but all the leaves got eaten off because there are no ants to protect them. So we contrast this with that. That's about as clean an experiment as you've possibly made, but it is, shall we say, derived from and driven by what we actually saw happen in nature before the experiment was ever even thought of. Okay. Now, logically, coming at this, if somebody explains about acacias and all that kind of stuff, you might say, oh, well, let's do an experiment. But in fact, what happened was the experiment occurred in nature, and that gave me real clues as to which way to go. So that's what, after 45 days. Here's the stump, the 65 centimeter stump in Caio's hands right there after 9 months. So here, look at the top of the tree. This is all 9 months worth of growth from this 65 centimeter tall stump right here. This is the growth from the experimental plot, which is just a few meters away with a 65 centimeter tall stump. This is what has survived in a stump with the sprouts that has no protective ants. So the difference is between there and this. So now the question is, do the ants do anything for the tree? Yes, they do. This is about as unambiguous as you can be. But we have left a big question hanging in the air through these last 10 minutes or whatever it is taking me to explain this. We'll get to that big question shortly. Who's doing the damage? Well, this is a katydid, for example, who's busily eating a thorn. This is a thorn right here, green thorn, and the katydid is simply eating it. That's an herbivore. Here's the leaves with Belgian bodies on them because there's no ant colony to harvest those Belgian bodies. So here's the thorn, green thorn with no ants on it and being eaten by katydid. This is a beetle who has just cut off a stem that's the diameter of your finger. So she's grabbed a hold of the tree and bitten into it, bitten and bitten and bitten and bitten and bitten until the whole thing fell off the top. Now, why did she cut off a meter of this tree? Because before she did this, she laid an egg in the tissue of the piece she's cutting off. And her larva then mined in the tissue and grew up to be another beetle like this. So she's an herbivore. She doesn't eat leaves. She basically cuts off big chunks of the tree. If there were ants on here, she would never, ever make it. So she can only make it in trees that naturally have lost their ant colony. Okay. Or I've removed the ant colony, which is what the case was in this particular case here. Okay. And now the question becomes, is it just the herbivores, the things that eat leaves, that are the problem if you don't have an ant colony? Well, here's Kaio again. He's almost 2 meters tall and holding a meter stick over his head. And here's an acacia right here, a nice healthy one. So you can see how much we've got here. This is all the general vegetation and then the stump sprouts from the acacias underneath here. And that's after 9 months in this vegetation. If there's no ant colony, this is 9 months in that vegetation. In other words, it's not gone anywhere. It's not gotten above the shade from the neighboring plants. So here, this one here, we cut down, left the ant colony with it, left this here as competitors, and they shaded the stump, but the ants here have done something to this vegetation. Here, there's no ant colony. So the stump has gotten a full shade and basically is dead or very close to dead. Well, what's going on? Well, here's what happens. These are nice acacias in a nice field. And I use pesticide to remove the ant colony without touching the tree. So in this case, it's parathion, which is a very dangerous pesticide, and I didn't realize that as a graduate student. I nearly killed myself with it. And so these trees, this nice, healthy-looking acacia here, suddenly lost its ant colony, not by being cut down, by being sprayed with parathion. This is what it looks like 9 months later. It's a great vine trellis. The vines grow right up on top of it, cover it over, shade it out, and kill it. So what's the relationship of these vines to the acacia ants? Well, here's a vine, nice, healthy, growing tip of a vine. And what this vine is trying to do is find something to grow up onto. So it's sort of swinging around in the wind and will eventually touch the anacacia. When it touches the anacacia, it ends up looking like that. Well, there we go between this, nice new leaves right here, healthy tissues, nice new shoots, this warped over. Look at the surface, all scarred. These are the ants biting and stinging the vine until it dies. So they literally kill the plants. Now you look at this photograph of an acacia. Here's the acacia, and now you know what you're looking at. You see, here's all this vegetation growing up around it in this old pasture. And look at what's underneath it. Nothing. In other words, the ants have walked down from the tree out on the ground and killed everything in this patch, the so-called basal circle. Now, when you're a graduate student and you're confronted with something like this, and you look at it and say, nobody will believe me, what I actually did was take various kinds of seeds, corn, wheat, rice, beans, and planted them in little rows from the base of the tree out to here, and watched what the ants did to the new to the new seedlings as they came up. And what the ants do is they kill the seedlings, no problem. But if they find the seed where they can get it, they actually pick up the seed, walk out here to the edge, and drop it. So the ant colony is cleaning, is producing a space in which all these leaves can grow without being threatened by vines and by other plants who can crowd into them. And when a fire sweeps through, look what happens. There's so little vegetation underneath the tree that the fire doesn't actually burn under there. So here's the charcoal remaining of the rest of the vegetation. And see the green leaves up here? Because of this circle down here, the ant colony survived. So this has got a nice healthy ant colony in it up here because of this bare area. However, that is not something, this is not something evolved by the tree or the ant colony, because the fires here are completely European recent. In other words, this is not something that's been part of the evolutionary history of the trees and the ant colonies. What it is an accident, as an outcome of the fact that humans come along, make pastures, the trees grow up in them with low vegetation. They burn them in the dry season to get rid of the low vegetation. And this trait right here happens to lead to survival. Now, if this became part of the regular environmental routine of these colonies and these trees, you would find selection for the ants to become more and more thorough in cleaning this area underneath the tree, because that would then be a selective advantage, which would make a higher probability that the top would not be burned. Okay? And the interesting thing about it, I showed you that the names of 3 ant acacias very early on: Pseudomyrmex, beltai, ferruginea, and nigrocincta. Beltai, the black one, makes almost no basal circle. So if these were beltai colonies, there'd be nothing or just a tiny bit of bare area underneath here. If this was nigrocincta, which normally lives in the full shade inside the forest, which never burns, they don't make much of a basal circle. But ferruginea, which is the one who lives in these open habitats like this, makes these huge basal circles. So there's a difference in the 3 species of ants as to, this is not just an accidental behavior. This is an actual genome program behavior in these 3 different species of ants. So you can see which, now if you've got a habitat, an environment where fires and pastures are all part of the regular year in and year after, you eventually end up with an area where almost all the species, all the colonies of these ant acacias are ferruginea. With the black one that doesn't make a circle, and the nigrocincta, which makes just a sloppy circle in the deep shade, those ants would nearly disappear out of these pastures. But you can't, it's very hard to figure out, thinking backwards, what were the selective circumstances that those 3 species of ants ended up evolving a genome that makes a big circle or a small circle. That's extremely difficult to figure out. And it's difficult today also because humans have destroyed so much of the habitat that it's very hard to know what the different habitat heterogeneities were, where these different ant species did the best. Speaking of shade, This is a healthy ant colony of the same age tree as this one. But this one is in the shade. This one's in the sun. So you can see what difference it makes to the ant colony and to the acacia if they have the ability and the aggressiveness to kill vines and to cut away other vegetation around the tree. Because, of course, with all these leaves, what the tree is making a lot of thorns, a lot of Belgian bodies, a lot of nectar, but also making a lot of seeds. And, of course, this ant colony will be making a lot of reproductive queens and males as well. So the reproductive rate goes way up, even though the actual numbers of ants are very similar on these two, but one's in the shade and one's in the sun. Now, Europe, when Bell came back to Europe and he published his little book, Europeans simply were not thinking about insects as the herbivores that would feed on the Acacias. But for some reason, and I think probably because most of them had some experience in Africa, where there's another set of Acacias, which are very definitely fed on by giraffes and elephants and gazelles and a variety of big African mammals. Their question was, well, if the ants are protecting the trees, then it's got to be against mammals. So once I learned about the European arguments in many different languages, I realized that I needed to do something to deal with this question, because people just didn't want to think about insects. So I had to find a naive wild animal who could eat an anacacia, because those animals were around 9,000 years ago. We're going to find out about them in a later lecture. Okay. Humans have extinguished them 9,000 years ago. We're going to find out more about that later. All right. So what I had was cows, horses, mules, pigs as domestic animals, but those weren't. I mean, the purist ecologists were very quick to say, "Oh, well, those are introduced domestic animals," totally forgetting what I'll emphasize to you later on, that the horse was evolutionarily invented here. And the Spaniards brought it back. It's not that it's an introduced animal, it's a native animal who we extinguished, and then we brought it back from another place. It's as though if you could go in and get dinosaurs, or you could go in and get giant ground sloths and bring them back. Okay? That's what the horse is. But nobody wanted to hear anything about that. We hadn't even, that idea that I just said to you was not even in play yet in the scientific literature. So I found one animal. This is a native brocket deer. This is an adult, full-grown adult, about the size of a German Shepherd. And it had been raised as from a very small fawn in the house by people with feeding on their front lawn, feeding on garden grasses. It's never experienced the outside world. So I had a naive animal who was fully native and wild. And I found the owner of this thing, and he gave me permission to experiment with this brocket deer. Now, I only had one animal, so this is always going to be one experiment. Okay? So really what it is gives you an idea what can happen with a wild vertebrate. So here's a branch for which I have removed all the ants, but left the leaves intact. Here's my hand. Here's Kaio's hand over here. The thorns don't have any ants in them. The leaves are intact. And so I simply offer this to the deer to see what he does. Well, he eats them like crazy. The leaves are just wonderful from the standpoint of the deer. He thinks they're just yummy, yummy, yummy. Okay. And very busily eats the leaves. And he ends up with a branch that looks like this. And I'll go back to the previous one. You see the full leaves, and now look at it this way. Notice two things. The deer has taken a lot of leaf off the branch, but he's cut off a lot of leaves right about where the tip of the thorn is. In other words, he didn't go down to the base and take the whole leaf. He chopped it off, 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 leaving this little fringe of some stuff, i.e., the thorns serve as some defense. Not a very powerful one, but some. Okay, that's very different than losing all your leaves, I can tell you that. If this was an event with a real herbivore out there in the wild, this branch is much better off than would be the case if the deer had taken all of the leaves. So that's not a co-evolved response of any sort. Sorry, I got something out of order here. Just a minute. Let me go back. Damn, somehow I have lost a slide. Okay, what I'm going to show you, somehow I have misplaced a slide, is that when, yes, now I remember. So this is eating the good leaves, all right? But later on, we gave the deer a branch like this with the ants on it. So what did the deer do then? Well, it went right into where it's eating them. First thing that happened was an ant ran off, ran up over its nose like this, and started to sting it right about here. And this deer has a very long tongue. And the tongue came out, reached up on the top, and wiped the ant off. It went back to eating leaves. Another ant did the same thing just a few seconds later. And a third ant did the same thing later. At that point, the deer said, no more. Stop. Just walked away. And from there on, he would never eat a single leaf because the taste and the flavor of the leaf, the odor of the leaf, said to him, you get stung if you eat this. So you just wouldn't take it from me at all. Very friendly deer. He liked food, all kinds, but anymore, I couldn't offer him a single leaf. And all it took was one learning experience. So this thing in nature would have learned that as a fawn the first time it went up to one of these acacias. It would have learned it from then on. So it's really the ants who are doing the defensive. Now, we have a set of interactants here who are not co-evolved with this system. Now, somebody asked a question in Piazza about symbiosis. This word symbiosis, which you hear in the newspapers and in biology books and all this, it's a very sloppy word. It means interaction between two species. It can be a parasite. It can be a predator. It can be herbivore. It can be anything. Pair two things, two different species doing things together. That's a symbiotic relationship. Often it's used to mean a positive relationship, like bees pollinating flowers, but it doesn't have to be. The much more accurate word is, for the positive ones, is a mutualism. So this is a mutualism between an ant and an acacia. But remember, there's two ways to be a mutualism. One is to evolve it, like the ants and the acacias have. The other is that it's effectively because the two species are in the same environment, and one comes along and helps the other, and vice versa. But we don't have any evolution vis-a-vis one or the other. Or if we do, it's just diffuse evolution between not any particular kind of insect and a particular kind of plant. So bees and flowers are a nice example. Flowers are, of course, co-evolved with bees. And bees have all kinds of morphology to go with flowers. However, many bees are generalists. They go to any flower because what they're after is nectar. And so all they got to do is find the flower. They learn the flower is there. They go to it. So they're not co-evolved with that particular species of flower. Now, there are a set of bees who are co-evolved with specific species of flowers, but a lot of them are not. So the word symbiosis applies broadly. It's a sort of an interaction. If you were to introduce tigers into the New World and the tiger ran around and ate a white-tailed deer, that's a symbiotic relationship, but it's not co-evolved between the tiger and the white-tailed deer. A mountain lion and a white-tailed deer is a different matter because mountain lions are native here. Okay. So let's look at some of these things that are not co-evolved and how do they operate. Well, the first one is a moth, This is its name, Syssphinx mexicana. And as you can tell from the name mexicana, it occurs in Mexico. Actually, it occurs way down here to Costa Rica as well. One of these flew in our front door just a month ago, 2 months ago. And down here, it's given a different name, but that's the way taxonomy works. We'll get to that kind of thing later lectures. But anyway, this is a name. This is a handle that you can put on it. And this is an acacia, but as is obvious, it's lost a lot of its leaves. So where'd the leaves go? Well, there is the guilty party. Right there. That's a caterpillar about the diameter and length of your index finger. Okay, so something about the size of that. That's a full-grown one. This is about a month old. And it has eaten, well, actually it and its sisters and brothers, there will be about 4 or 5 of them on this acacia. And they will have eaten all of the leaves off this tree. There was enough leaves on that tree to grow up 4, 5, 6 of these guys. And we're going to get up to why there's 4 or 5. Why I can say confidently there are 4 or 5 or 6 on this acacia. Incidentally, in this photograph, see the flowers right here, the inflorescences? There's the inflorescence that we showed you a photograph of last time of a bee collecting pollen off the surface, i.e. it was pollinating it, but not pollinating in a coevolved relationship. That's a bee that goes to all kinds of flowers, gets contaminated with pollen in the process because it's seeking the pollen, and then it goes back home and scrapes the pollen off to feed its own larvae. So this is not evolved for them at all. It's evolved for another pollinator. But they're in there, they're being thieves. They're being somebody stealing food from the grocery store. Anyway, that's what this is. But you can see the other thorns here. All the leaves have been eaten off, except the growing tip. You see right here, that's the brand new shoot tip. That's where the new leaves are produced. So incidentally, when this tree wants to replace this leaf, it first has to make a shoot tip like this in the axil of that leaf. And then a little branch comes out of here, and on the end of that branch can be more leaves. Okay? So here, right at the tip, is the brand new leaves. And right here are brand new leaves. These over here are gone, and I'll explain why they're gone in a minute. You see, that's just a stump right there at the tip. But this one here is still intact. There's a new shoot tip growing right there, intact. There's another one there. But these caterpillars are eating everybody else. Why? The oldest ants in the colony, i.e. the most experienced ants in the colony, were in that queen thorn, protecting her. Remember that earlier last time? We broke open the queen thorn, and there was the queen, and then about 60 or 70 individual workers. Those were the nearly oldest ants, or perhaps the oldest ants. If you were to take a sample of 10 or 12 or 15 ants patrolling right here, they would be also the oldest ones in the colony. I.e., this and the queen are the 2 most valuable pieces of the tree from the colony standpoint and the tree standpoint, because that's how you make more leaves. So, as this gal or guy goes trundling up the stem, eating a new leaf, eating a leaf, eating a leaf, eating a leaf, when he gets up to right about here, these old experienced ants, and we know this by marking them individually, these old experienced ants really rev up and say, no way. So they pile on and they sting in the mouth. That's the one place they can get to this caterpillar. So they bite and they sting in the mouth of the caterpillar. And eventually the caterpillar says, okay, not for me. And the caterpillar turns around and walks back down the stem and looks for other leaves. Okay? So it and its sisters and brothers will eventually get all of the old leaves off this tree, except these shoot tips. Well, that's obviously an evolved behavior on the part of the ant colony. Okay. Shoot tips are normal for all kinds of plants, so there's nothing special about that particular thing. The behavior of the caterpillar here, of trundling up the tree, tolerating an ant sting here, an ant sting there, a little bite here, a little bite there, that's probably evolved as well. And the turning around and giving up when you're up here. Now, see over here, there's a stump I told you before where the shoot tip is gone. That's a different caterpillar who, in this daytime photograph, is sitting over here somewhere, a meter, 2 meters away from this ant acacia. And in the nighttime, it runs over to the acacia, which it's found on earlier days, runs over to the acacia, runs very fast up the tree trunk to see if it can get to a shoot tip before the old ants realize he's there. And while he's going up and getting right to the end, the ants do become aware of him. They reach out, they grab the caterpillar holds on with its hind feet at the back end, reaches around with its front end, grabs the ant who's now stinging and biting it with its forelegs and throws it off the tree. It can do this at the rate of about 1 per second. And we'll sit there and do this for 10 seconds, 15 seconds, some number of times like that. And if it gets all the ants off the tip right here, it whips around and eats the shoot tip very, very fast, and then runs off the tree. So it's a dart in, grab what you can grab and get the hell out of there kind of insect. And that's a totally evolved behavior, and it only does that to Acacias. Doesn't do that to any other plants in the habitat. That thing is called Coxina haydonoides. It has evolved its behavior to make use of this food source and survive its defenses. But the acacia hasn't done anything for that. The ants have, and it's beaten the ants. The ants have not evolved anything to get rid of it. So it's there as a regular, the acacias outside of my front door here have got that same stumped off end up here. They've got these caterpillars and some tranches with the nice intact things where these caterpillars have been pushed away and not fed on it. So what's the moth look like? Oh, sorry, here's the caterpillar close up. Now here's the caterpillar walking up a branch. And there's the ant right there. As you can see, the ant is walking and he's stretched out. This is Beltai, Pseudomyrmex is the black one. And none of these have their abdomen doubled under and are stinging. They're actually walking around on the caterpillar. It's just part of the tree from their standpoint. In other words, they are patrolling him and they will protect him against parasites as though he's just another stem. Now, how do you get to that situation? Here's mom. She's about 2 inches long from top to bottom. So it's a fairly large moth. Now, absent my interference with this system, she flies through the dark testing acacias. What she wants to find is an acacia with a healthy ant colony. So she lands on the tree. If she's attacked immediately, that's a good tree. If she's not attacked immediately, she leaves. It's not a good place. Because being attacked means it's a healthy tree with lots of leaves. And it's the black dark. It's a healthy tree with lots of leaves and a healthy ant colony. So she lands on that tree. She lays, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 eggs. Now, why 6? It could be 4, it could be 5, it could be 3. When she landed on this tree that had lots of ants, the ants immediately attacked her. But can you see that this is covered with long hair? These are all hairs. They're short hairs, but they're dense. Everything about her, her body, her wings, are all covered with a dense fur. The ants run up, they grab the fur in their mouth parts, pull it away, and reach into the bare spot and start to sting. Do that here, do that there, do it here, do it there, do it here. All this time she's laying eggs. 1, 2, 3, 4. When she gets about 3 to 5 eggs, she's had enough of it. I can't take the stings anymore. I bail out. Gone. So she ends up putting the right number of eggs on the tree for her kids to have enough food to develop all the way. Now, how do I know this? Because by accident, I was sleeping out in the middle of these pastures with the trees, and I saw her flying against a night sky, watched her doing this, and discovered that when I took the ant colonies off of the trees, so she didn't have any other trees, they were all unoccupied. She finally was forced, I'm saying, she's only going to live about 6 days. So she's got to lay those eggs. She's got 300 eggs to lay. She finally ends up landing on a tree with seemingly a lot of leaves, but no ant colony. She lands, she starts to lay eggs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 30 eggs on the same tree because nobody's kicking her off. This number of eggs is actually adjusted to how long she can tolerate being stung. So if she's not being stung, she just keeps laying eggs like a little machine. And so all those eggs hatch. They eat all the leaves off, and they all die of starvation. Bingo, gone. She had to have an occupied anacacia to go through her life cycle. Now, so here's our eggs. And as you can see, they've been chewed. That's chewed by the caterpillar leaving the egg. See, this is an exit hole where it's cut, the little caterpillar cut a hole out. Here it is. This is the caterpillar eating the remainder of the egg shell. Same thing over here, because the caterpillar is inoculating its gut with mom's caterpillars. Remember, mom was a caterpillar beforehand. So she carries in her the bacterium that her caterpillar had in its gut. Those are contaminating the eggs. So she eats the eggshell. The caterpillars eat the eggshell to get their own colony going, their own microbes going in their gut. Okay. I'm saying part of this to you just to illustrate how complicated nature can be when you start dissecting it down to the individual pieces. Now, but how is it that the ants did not remove these eggs? Well, the first thing is that you see the diameter of this egg? It's very hard, shiny like plastic, hard and smooth. The ant mandibles cannot move far enough apart to get around that egg. So the ant can't grab the egg. It can only try to grab it, and it never makes it. So it starts right in, stinging and trying to bite the egg. The ants pile on. They're all doing this. After 24 hours, 12 hours, 15 hours, 2 days, they get basically bored with it. Now, the way that actually is that as they're doing all this, the eggs are getting the odor of the colony. Every colony has its own individual chemical odor. It's like every dog on the street knows who he is because he's got a different odor than the other dog does. Every colony has got a different odor. So by the time these eggs hatch, which is 6 days after lasting, not only have the eggs gotten the odor of the colony, but the little tiny first instar larva has acquired the odor through the permeable wall of the egg. So it walks right into those ants, and the ants it's just another piece of leaf, stem. It's another part of the colony. Until it gets up there and tries to eat the shoot tip at the top of the tree. At that point, the guards say, "Oh, whoa, not for you." And they force it back, but they don't follow it. They force the caterpillar back down the stem, but then go back up to patrolling the tip. They do not chase the caterpillar. I learned all this by standing out there watching it happen day after day after day. Okay. So it's the same thing as being in a laboratory. Ozon's got his urban room with his microscope and all those things, looking at details like that, all right? So my laboratory was those cattle pastures and those old cornfields. Different color, different shape, different ownership, but the same thing. Okay. So that's how this thing works. Now, there's only one last thing to mention here before we get to that guy. We look at our caterpillar here. I said that the ants protect the caterpillar because, so the caterpillar obviously, the Syssphinx mexicana only feeds on Acacias, okay? Mom won't put eggs anywhere else. And if you try to give these young larvae food of another species of plant, they simply turn their noses up at it and won't eat it. So they're specialized on the Acacia. So they're evolved to the Acacia, but the Acacia is not co-evolved to them. Okay? They're a problem for the Acacia. Now, if you take this caterpillar and you put him on another Acacia, what happens? It goes nuts because the other colony goes crazy trying to kill him because he's got the odor of his home colony. And so he's recognized immediately as being not my town, not my village, not my unit, not my tribe, if you like. Okay. But there is a parasite who gets through this whole defense system. It's a fly, a big fly, who flies around inspecting Acacias, looking for this caterpillar. And when it sees the caterpillar, it doesn't approach the caterpillar. It sits for a few seconds about a foot away from the caterpillar and glues a single egg to the leaf. And then it goes another direction about a foot, does the same thing. Another one, so it makes a little cloud around the caterpillar of leaves with single eggs on it. Well, what happens is, of course, evolutionarily, the genome of the fly knows that the caterpillar is eventually going to eat that leaf, and it swallows the egg in the process. The egg hatches inside the caterpillar, hides inside the caterpillar to escape from the immune response of the caterpillar until the caterpillar is fully developed. And at that point, the fly larva turns on, eats the entire inside of the caterpillar, drops out, waits until it pupates. The caterpillar makes a pupa, and then it makes its own fly pupa inside of the caterpillar pupa, which is now in the litter on the ground underneath the Acacia. And eventually that fly comes out. So that's a way of getting past the ant colony. There's a second animal who is evolved to survive in the system called Pellinota punctulata. This is a big beetle. That's what it looks like. It's about 1.5 inches long. And as you can see, the ants are not happy with its presence. They're stinging it, they're biting it, and they will continue to do so. This guy is effectively a tank. They can't get through to him. They can't get into his mouth. They can't get through any part of him. So he spends his whole lifetime in a little cloud of ants, with them attacking and attacking and attacking. Eventually, he gets the colony odor. But this beetle, as opposed to the caterpillar, at night leaves his Acacia, flies around, looks for lady beetles, does all the different things that beetles do, and then goes back to an Acacia before the sun comes up. So it parks itself during the daytime on the Acacia. Its eggs are in the litter underneath, and the larvae of the beetle are eating the roots of the Acacia. And the adult nibbles on those leaves now and then, not very much. It's not, the damage it does to the tree is pretty trivial. But this guy is only on Acacias, except at night when it's flying around looking for the opposite sex and looking for other acacias in which you put their eggs underneath, and they end up flying in over my shoulder and hitting my laptop screen at night, as a matter of fact. So its name is Pellinota punctulata, and that's just to say that this guy is making use of the anacacia. It's evolved to it, but the anacacia is not at all co-evolved to the beetle. Finally, see the white object right there? And there's another white object right there. And there's another object right there. These are objects in the anacacia crown. Right? So here's our anacacia crown. Notice it's all free of vegetation around it. No other vines, shrubs close to it. That's the ants doing that. If you get up close to those, this is a wasp nest. And this is a bird nest and another bird nest built in the anacacias for protection. So if an army ant colony comes along who are predators on wasp nests and starts up this tree trunk, the ants of the anacacia attack them and drive them off. So they never get to this wasp nest. The birds gain the same protection from monkeys. So a monkey will not sit in this tree. It gets stung too badly. The birds make their nest in the tree by flying in, putting down nest material, and flying away. They keep doing it over and over and over again. And the outcome of this is that the nest achieves the colony odor. So now that the ants think that this is simply part of the anacacia, and it's entered through a tunnel. It's not an open nest. It's entered through a tunnel. So the bird is not sitting out here on the tree branches. It zips in the tunnel, and for some bizarre reason, these ants do not go into the dark cavities in the bird nest. I have no idea why. But these are animals making use of the anacacia. So they've evolved to make use of it, but they are not, the tree and the ant colony are not evolved to deal with them. Sorry, that's the last slide. I want to stop there, obviously, because I've just run out of slides as well. I think you can guess from what I've said here that we could go on probably for hours talking about the many little details of interactions of the anacacia and its ant colony on the one hand, the co-evolved ones, and then all the other animals in the habitat who make use of this system in one way or another. Well, if you think, oh, that's exceptional, in fact, we can tell stories like this about each one of these other species of plants in this habitat. That is one of the characteristics of tropical habitats. They are, you look and you just see a big patch of greenery, but in fact, you're looking at a very complex interaction of many species doing many different things with each other. And just to finish that off, I would like to point out that when people talk about impact of deforestation or pesticides or climate change or any of the other kinds of perturbations, logging, that you can think of in these systems, you're perturbing these very complicated interactions, just like you took a very high quality, very expensive wristwatch, popped it open and poured sand into it. I mean, there's a lot of interactions going on there that you can't see unless you spend a lot of time looking very, very closely at the different actors and what they do with each other. And they do depend very much on each other. So that if you take out the anacacias, then a whole set of other things happen in the system. A whole set of other species disappear if you take out the anacacias. Or if you take the acacia ants out, a whole bunch of other species disappear from the system because they're all interdependent in so many, many different ways. There has been a lot of ecological theory developed in the past about what are called keystone species. Species that if you remove them, then there's a big perturbation effect on others. Well, in fact, as you get to look closely at these systems and all their different partners, you discover that all species are keystone species. It's just that sometimes when you remove one, the perturbations are very visible to humans, to us big mammals, diurnal mammals. But if you, the others that don't have that kind of visible impact have many other much smaller impacts that that are very visible if you're in fact looking very carefully at them and for them. So we're about 10 minutes early today, and so we'll stop now. And just know that next Tuesday we're on for the third lecture, and that one will be one entire topic for one entire lecture of an hour and 20 minutes. It won't be split into two like the one that we're finishing up right now. You're welcome to keep asking questions in Piazza. I would appreciate it, but I don't require it. If you tack your name onto it, so I can again get a feeling for who's asking what questions, that helps. We have some issues with Piazza because we haven't figured out yet how to make copies of answers and questions and replies, especially if they're a long reply. But we'll work on that, and we'll know more later on. So there we go. So I will turn off now. Unless, Ozan, is there a particular question I should address to everybody that you encountered?
So there are a couple of questions. One of them is, do only the males of the beetles live on the acacia?
Do only the males of the beetles nibble the acacia?
Yeah,
Do only the male beetles nibble the acacia?
Live on the acacia? No. Both sexes of the beetles live on the acacias, but the males, the females, like many insects, sit tight where they are and produce pheromones to attract the males. And so the male is out there flying around in the dark, trying to find a mating female, a mateable female. What I don't know about the beetle is whether it mates multiple times or only once. The moth female mates only one time in her life. So she calls once, and that's it. Whereas many insects call multiple times. They take in the sperm, they evaluate the sperm, decide whether it's sperm they want, and if it's not, they just digest it, so it becomes a protein source. And if it's sperm that they evaluate to be high quality, then they go ahead and use that for fertilization of their own kids. But this is very common behavior in many other insects, and for that beetle, I have no idea which one of these routes it follows.
And another question asks, do the beetles always fly back to the same acacia plant during the day? Because the scent is the same.
Do the beetles always fly back to the same acacia during the day?
We have no idea. That's the kind of study that people like me love to do, but it takes time and money and equipment and energy and all these kind of things, because a beetle that size, you could put little radios on and little sensors on, and you can track them just like a bird with a sensor on it flying from England to South Africa. Well, you can follow that little beetle all over the pasture if you had the little gadgets, which we do now have, and glued one onto the beetle's wings and or on its belly, and simply follow it to know where it goes and what it does. But that kind of thing, there's that sort of thing that society generally won't support you with rent and peanut butter sandwiches to do.
And one last question is, do you say the concept of a keystone species is untrue or biased, and all that species to some degree have the attributes of a keystone species?
I didn't quite catch do you say the concept of a keystone species is what?
Untrue or biased.
Is whether it's biased is the part that I'm catching.
Oh, well,
whether all species have.
Yeah, what it is bias may not be quite the right word. It's just that it was invented and noticed around a system where if you take out starfish on the coast, on the rocks on the coast in the intertidal zone, immediately a whole lot of things happen of the other organisms who live on the rocks in the coastal zone. So there's a big visible impact of removing starfish. So the starfish gets called a keystone species. But in fact, That was by people who look at big things. When you get somebody, crazy people like me who look at little tiny things like insects, what you discover is they're all keystone species. Every single one of them, when you remove it, has a ripple effect out through its various interactions. And the more species in the habitat, the more the ripple. It would be easy to make a list of 50 species of insects whose populations and community structure would be strongly changed if we simply extinguished and eliminated the Acacias from here, where we are, for example.
I think that concludes. If you haven't signed up for the Piazza, please sign up for Piazza so that you will see the questions. And that's it.
Okay. Can everybody see the questions on Piazza and the answers? Yeah, okay.
Yes. Okay.
I think we can finish here, right?
Okay.
We can finish here, right?
We finish here, yeah, okay.
Yes.